All right, so hi everyone. My name is Maya Schonbach, and I am the clinical psychologist and the clinical program director here at Stop OCD. And today we're going to talk about different metaphors that we use in ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy, specifically for OCD. So when you hear the word metaphor, you might think we're talking about something literary, might throw you back to high school, or maybe just kind of something that's like an interesting way to look at things, or theoretical. But actually, in ACT, metaphors, we use them for a practical reason. They're really tools. They can help us recognize different patterns that are usually more difficult to see when we're inside of them, and they're more abstract. So it helps us kind of get outside of our heads. So today we're going to talk about a bunch of different examples. The webinar is going to take around 45 minutes, and I really encourage you guys to ask as many questions or share any comments that you have in the Q&A in the chat as we go through, and I'll respond to them all together once the presentation is over. And also, I really encourage you guys to stick around until the end because I'll share a promo code at the end of our program, of the end of the for our program at the end of the presentation. So let's get started. So this is just a brief outline. We'll go into a little bit about OCD and ACT, give some brief definitions. How do we break down OCD? What is ACT? And then we'll give some different examples of metaphors that we like to use for different purposes, different kind of jobs. So the first is noticing the struggle, specifically for OCD. The second one is more general in ACT about the idea of changing your relationship with thoughts, but it's so important for OCD. Then we'll talk again, another thing that's also more typical in ACT about the idea of making room for discomfort. They experience a lot of that in OCD. And then moving toward what matters. And that's a lot about the idea of working with values and making room for things in your life. We'll get into that. And then we'll talk about specifically how to use metaphors wisely. Because especially with OCD and a lot of things can turn into compulsions or compulsive behaviors. And we don't want that to happen. So how we can use metaphors in a wise, healthy manner. We'll do a summary and, like I said, the Q&A all together. All right, so let's get started by talking a bit about OCD. Brief overview just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page. And then also learn a little bit about the background, just really what ACT is. Mhm. All right. Okay, so let's start just by looking at the OCD cycle. Like I said, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. If this feels like a review, it's always good to go over it again. I like going through it every time. So basically, the OCD cycle typically starts with some form of a trigger. So a trigger can be anything for anyone. It's very individual. It can be something external, something like touching a surface that feels contaminated, driving past someone or something, things like that. But it could also be internal, right? It could be a memory popping up. It can be a physical body sensation. It could be a thought that appears seemingly out of nowhere. And then that initial trigger is followed by an intrusive thought, typically, or it could be an image or an urge, typically filled with, accompanied with a lot of doubt. Um, and especially um, the big key difference with OCD is the interpretation of the thought. So, for example, if the intrusive thought could be, what if I left the door unlocked? The interpretation of the thought is essentially that this thought, the importance there is that the interpretation of the thought is that it has meaning. So if I think all of a sudden it pops into my head, what happens if I left the door unlocked? Then I might interpret it as, uh-oh, if I thought that, must mean that I don't remember properly. And there's a real possibility that something horrible will happen and I'll be responsible. And then obviously that leads to feelings of distress or danger. And could be guilt, could be disgust, right? Lots of distress. And then because of that horrible feeling, people have the urge to get rid of it, do something about it. So that leads us to do a compulsion or avoidance behavior. So it could be compulsions, could be external. We call them covert, sorry, overt behaviors, things that we are able to see. So it could be classic things like washing your hands, flipping the switch, knocking on things, checking many times, asking for reassurance, or they could be mental compulsions or covert compulsions, things like mentally reviewing, counting in your head, um, saying something like a mantra over and over again. And essentially, what the goal of these behaviors are to reduce the distress that's caused by the intrusive thought, initially, the obsession. And in the short term, they work. It does work. It reduces, it gives you some illusion of control and some attempt to gain some some certainty with doubt. We say that OCD is typically a disorder around doubt. Um, but in the long run, the problem is with these compulsions and avoidance behaviors, it really doesn't work in the long run. And then it just continues and strengthens the cycle because the next time you have a trigger pops up, you're gonna have another intrusive thought, you're gonna interpret it badly, you're gonna feel the distress, and you're gonna say, wow, my brain learned, wow, if I do this compulsion, it's gonna calm me down. And it just reinforces the behavior in the long run. So basically, the idea here is that ACT really doesn't try and give us this illusion of certainty with this compulsion and avoidance. It helps us try to notice the discomfort that we feel and kind of make room for it, and then choose how you want to respond. That's the real key thing that ACT helps us do. So, like I said, make room for thoughts, urges, and uncertainty. So if OCD is kind of saying, how do I get rid of this feeling? ACT is saying, okay, given that I feel this or I think this right now, how do I want to respond? So again, it doesn't mean that you become reckless or irresponsible, and it doesn't mean that you agree with your obsession, or were pretending that anxiety or the distress feels pleasant. Um, Sorry, I just wanted to check. I see a comment in the chat, and I just want to make sure that everybody can hear. Somebody said that they see two images of the speaker, and the screen with the PowerPoint is small. Um, yes, sorry, we are doing this format. The screen, the points on the screen are very small. They're just really just to support. Just it's more supposed to be like a conversation. So I hope that clarifies things. Um, but there will be the recording will be uploaded, so you can see this later as well if you want to zoom in. So like I was saying about choosing your actions rather than obeying OCD. So really, it means that it helps you act, recognizes that we have these thoughts and feelings, and we practice choosing what we want to do next. And in ACT, there's this term that we call psychological flexibility. And basically, what that means is being able to experience something uncomfortable and then essentially not allowing it dictate or decide your behavior. That's like the way I like to describe it specifically in with respect to OCD. And so, for example, you could have the thought of, oh, maybe I offended my friend in the conversation, and then you instantly feel guilt and you're responsible, and this urge to kind of reread the conversation. Um, and then if you had this kind of cognitive flexibility, you would then recognize that you have this feeling of, ooh, and the thought, oh, maybe I offended her, and this urge to like go over and over and over again the conversation. But really that you can decide, is this what I want to do? Do I want to talk to my friend and ask her? Do I want to just continue on doing what I was doing before, cooking my dinner or whatever? And really, the goal is to keep moving toward what matters. It's not to have control over your mind. We can't, unfortunately, do that. But it really is to have more freedom kind of in your actions. And again, we'll talk about this later, but really it's the idea that OCD often has a big kind of power and it takes over a large part of our lives. It pulls us away from things that are important to us. And everybody, it's different. It could be what's important to you. It could be family. It could be work. It could be friendships. We'll talk about this later about your different values, but it's really a lot about ACT. It's about reclaiming back more of your life and reclaiming it from OCD. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about research because ACT really is a newer approach within OCD treatment. But the research so far is promising. It says that ACT-based treatments really have been associated with a reduction in OCD symptoms. It can help reduce avoidance behaviors. Like I said, increase flexibility, psychological flexibility, being more responding to your thoughts in a more flexible manner. Um, and then ERP, I wrote here, so exposure and response prevention. That still is the number one kind of gold standard, best established treatment for OCD. And essentially, just one word, we have lots of webinars and information about that on our website, but essentially, ERP, exposure and response prevention, it essentially involves gradually, very gradually, approaching, doing exposure. So approaching situations or thoughts, essentially being exposed to the feeling. It's all essentially about the feeling, but you expose yourself to triggers so that the feeling arises. And then you choose not to respond with a compulsion that you typically do. So you prevent the response that you typically do. And it's been shown that ACT really is a great kind of support or framework to approach ERP. It doesn't replace it. So we'll talk about that also in a little bit because we don't want to calm the person down as they're doing the exposure. We don't want to get rid of the distress. We want to, in the exposure, what we want to do is we want to bring the distress up to a certain level. It sounds scary and it is very difficult. We want to bring it up to a certain level because at the end of the day, we're exposing ourselves to the emotion, not just to the trigger. The main goal is to expose yourself to the emotion and then teach your brain that it can not automatic, that it can go, I'm doing this because we draw it out as a wave, the wave of the emotion. But we teach your brain that if you do nothing, if you don't do the compulsion, if you prevent the response, that the distress subsides on its own. So basically, all of these metaphors and what we work on with ACT is that it supports it. It allows you to be with the distress, to accept it, not push it away. But I wrote here that more high quality research is needed because it definitely is new in the field and still ERP is the most well researched and we always need more research. Um, okay. So why use metaphors? We talked about this a little bit. But I wrote here so that OCD can turn explanations into debates. So OCD is very skilled with its kind of logic, right? It can say, okay, but this situation, it's actually different. What if this specific thought actually shows something really important about me? What if it actually means something really important about that? But the issue is that the more you argue with the OCD, the more the OCD argues back, right? And so, like I said, a metaphor kind of helps us see this pattern differently. So instead of trying to prove the OCD wrong, like if you're in a debate or in court or whatever, it helps you just notice the situation that you're in. Um, and so really the idea is that like I said, it can make abstract ideas easier to experience. So the idea of like noticing what situation we're in. Okay, that's super abstract. What does that really mean? And then metaphors kind of help us bring them down to the practical. Um, and things like acceptance, things like willingness. It really helps us be able to experience them and put them, recognize them and put them into practice in real time. So I wrote that a metaphor is useful when it changes what you do. So, like I said at the beginning, it's a little fine line with OCD is because that often it's things can be taken into kind of a mantra with OCD, right? Like that's a typical mental compulsion that some people do. And so we don't want to repeat metaphors in our head to kind of feel safe or to prove that the intrusive thought is meaningless. But really we want to see um, like I wrote at the bottom, the most useful question is, did this help me respond differently and return to what matters to me? Return to what I wanted to be doing. So let's start. I give a lot of preamble about metaphors and ACT and OCD, but I want to get into some specific jobs that the metaphors actually help us with. So the first is noticing the struggle. Then we'll talk about, like I said, changing your relationship with the thoughts. We'll talk about making room for discomfort, and then values and moving towards what matters. All right. So, like I said, we'll start by noticing the struggle. So, in OCD, often when an intrusive thought pops up, we instantly go into, oh my gosh, is this true? What does it mean about me? What if my feared outcome actually happens? Da, 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 da. We spiral into this loop and stress obsessions, and then the distress pops up because we interpret it as meaningful. Um, and really, this struggle, right, often feels like a solution. I need to continue analyzing. I need to continue reassurance, seeking reassurance. Um, Otherwise, I'll feel responsible. Otherwise, I'll feel contaminated. Otherwise, I'll feel not just right. But really, these are the struggle is what keeps us in that OCD cycle, like we discussed at the beginning. Um, and essentially, this is really what is so powerful about some of these metaphors is that they can help us see when we're trying to internally control our thoughts, our emotions, our experiences that really is just fighting and struggling with the OCD. So let's start by getting into some of these metaphors. So one that I really like is the idea of imagine that you're in a tug of war with OCD. So OCD is this big monster standing on the other side of a rope and you're pulling back and the OCD is asking you things like, what if I made a mistake? Or what if this thought says something about who I am? Or what if I'm responsible for somebody getting hurt? And so obviously, you're going to pull back. I'm going to try and prove the thought wrong. I'm going to review the conversation with my friend to make sure that I didn't hurt them. I'm going to internally monitor my feelings. Compulsions, 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 right? And so initially, it could feel like you're gaining ground, right? Like you're pulling back. And in that sense, you feel some relief, you feel some certainty, right? Like we talked about it, there is some reduction in distress. But the OCD is a huge monster. He keeps pulling. And then maybe it asks different questions. Okay, but what if I miss something? What if the reassurance that I got wasn't real? What if it was inaccurate? Um, and then the more you pull back, then they keep pulling and you just in an endless fight. And so essentially what this metaphor is saying with this tug of war is that we're trying to say is that ACT doesn't ask you to pull harder, um, or kind of argue the OCD in a specific way. Really, what we're saying here is we're trying in this tug of war to drop the rope. Okay? So when we're dropping the rope, we're not saying OCD is right. We're not saying, okay, the feared outcome, great, that can happen. But really, it's saying that I'm noticing that I'm in a struggle and I'm choosing not to continue this endless struggle for this alleged certainty that I can get. So again, it's this idea of accepting the fact that the doubt may still be there, and this giant OCD monster might still be there, but I'm not putting all of my energy into pulling against it. It's noticing that I'm in this struggle. So, first of all, this tug of war isn't always obvious, right? So sometimes this pulling back, like I said, it's these compulsions, right? So sometimes they're visible, like we talked about the overt compulsions of washing your hands or asking for reassurance. But again, sometimes they can be internal in your mind, mentally reviewing what happened, saying a mantra again and again, checking your feelings, your memories. And so also avoidance, right? Avoiding anything that might trigger, that's also a way of pulling. Um, and really, these are all strategies that are trying to protect yourself, trying to reduce the distress, trying to gain relief. But again, the OCD is just going to keep fighting back. And then once we're in the cycle, it just teaches your brain again and again that I need to do these compulsions in order to feel some sort of relief, and then it strengthens the cycle again and again, and then you get trapped in it. So really, when we notice the struggle, especially with this tug of war, we ask ourselves, what am I doing in response to this thought? Is it something that's helping me engage with the situation, or am I really trying to just make this intrusive thought disappear? So really what we're trying to recognize and notice that we're in this struggle with the tug of war and notice it as early as possible so that we can drop the rope. That's the key here, to drop the rope. Okay. So again, if anybody has any questions, definitely write in. Okay. Another metaphor that I really like, having to do with noticing the struggle, is of quicksand. So imagine you step into quicksand. So your immediate instinct is maybe to panic, to kick, to struggle, to try and get out as quickly as possible. But as we all know, this kind of frantic struggling really actually makes the situation worse, right? The more you fight, the more stuck you become. So OCD creates a really similar trap, right? It's the thought comes up and your mind says, "Okay, get rid of it right now." And then if we struggle harder by doing compulsions to try to get rid of it, um, it like I said, the distress might go down briefly, but over time, it makes everything feel more urgent and more important and more distressing. And so again, it doesn't mean that metaphors aren't one to one. It doesn't mean that we're going to be able to lie back and float in this lovely bed of quicksand, right? OCD it causes real distress. So it doesn't mean that we're forcing ourselves to relax, but um, you can say it can you can say to yourself, okay, I'm noticing now that I'm in this struggle, right? I'm trying to gain a certainty here. And really, our goal is not to sink into OCD. We're trying to stop doing the same thrashing, constant fighting that just gets us more and more stuck. Um, so like I said, so OCD might be asking you to try and escape, doing all of these um using uncertainty or causing you to feel anxiety or guilt or not just right, a sense of disgust or a sense of danger, um, and really act and is trying to help you understand in that this idea of this metaphor is saying, okay, I'm trying to see this broader struggle of I'm trying to make this uncertainty disappear. And then once you identify that you're in this process, that you get are stuck in this process, then you can try and stop doing the thrashing in the quicksand or dropping the rope. And then you have essentially more choice. Okay, so I like to try to break it down into kind of a practical tool. So, um, when OCD shows up, when you notice yourself getting caught in this struggle, this is what I would like to pause and ask yourself these questions. So first, you can ask yourself, what am I trying? What is OCD trying to get me to get rid of, to solve, to prevent right now? Something like that. Maybe you're trying to eliminate uncertainty or prove that something's untrue. And then number two is what am I trying to do to get relief? So this is here trying in real time to recognize what compulsions I'm doing. Am I checking things repeatedly? Am I asking for reassurance? Am I reassuring myself mentally? Am I saying a mantra? And then ask yourself, what does this response help me with right now? And what is it costing me later? Right? So say, okay, maybe I'll feel a little bit of relief now. But later, the question's still going to be nagging at me, right? Or might be taking up a lot of my time, a lot of my energy to do this. And then finally, ask yourself, what would dropping the rope look like right now, just for a few minutes? Okay, so not forever. You don't have to do it, promise yourself forever, but even just to take a small step, just not checking again, leaving a question to yourself unanswered, just and to return to the previous task that you were doing. Okay, so just to say, simply to notice that you're in the struggle and say to yourself, what could I do right now to drop the rope and refocus my attention and energy on what I was doing right before I noticed that I was inside this struggle. Okay, so the next job of kind of act metaphors that I want to talk about is the idea of changing your relationship with your thoughts. So there's a term in acceptance commitment therapy and ACT that we call cognitive diffusion. And essentially, what it means is learning to see a thought as um, something that your mind is kind of saying rather than something that you immediately have to believe or solve or act upon. Really just seeing your thoughts for simply thoughts. And the idea is that a thought can still cause you to feel uncomfortable, cause distress, and we can't make the thoughts go away. But really, if we are able to step back and notice that these are thoughts rather than direct kind of commands, then it allows us to choose and gives us the space to choose how we want to act next. Okay, so the first metaphor that I like is imagine that your mind is a radio that's just kind of always playing in the background. So sometimes it is broadcasting useful information, okay? Things like reminders or observations about the world, um, maybe planning something. And then at other times, it broadcasts things like criticism, disturbing images, endless what if chains. And so for somebody with OCD, your mind radio could be continuously or feel almost continuously kind of broadcasting, what if I contaminated something? Check again. You need to check one more time. Maybe, are you sure that this doesn't say something horrible about you? And really, it can feel so, so loud and so, so important. Um, and really, like we said, that it can feel like you need to debate kind of this radio all the time, try to correct it or prove that it's wrong, or maybe monitor your feelings about it. And really, in this kind of metaphor, we say to ourselves, okay, my mind right now is kind of broadcasting this thought, maybe that I made a terrible mistake, okay? Or you can say to yourself, okay, I hear you. You're on the OCD station again. You're on the check again station. Um, and really, I don't want to say this in a mocking manner, okay? It's also not to try and convince yourself that it's harmless. It's really the idea of this is to help kind of distinguish between a thought, meaning that I have to follow the instructions of it, versus, okay, I heard a message. Okay. And also to recognize that I don't have to turn off the radio before I leave the house or finish my job or continue the conversation that I'm just having or continue an exposure that I was just doing, right? I can have the radio going on and I can say, okay, I hear you, you're on, but I choose to continue doing what I was doing. All right, so another metaphor that I like is the mind train. So again, imagine that the different thoughts and emotions and bodily sensations that you have are like train cars on a train that are arriving at a station. And each kind of train car carries something different. So one train might carry the thought, um, what if something bad happens? Or another thought, another train might carry the urge to wash your hands again. Um, and all these different check again train and all of these different kind of train cars. And often what happens is we kind of get on board, we board these trains automatically, right? We don't even realize what's happened and we're already inside the compulsion, already inside the reassurance seeking. And then it kind of becomes harder and harder to remember what we were doing before the train arrived. And really, this idea of the mind train metaphor is to try and practice noticing the arrival of the train. You can say, okay, here's the doubt train pulling into the station, right? My mind is bringing up the what if I harmed someone train. And again, we're not preventing the trains from arriving. We don't, unfortunately, don't have control over that. Um, and we're not going to stand at the tracks and then argue with the train also, right? We can't, that's kind of like the tug of war. That's futile. Um, but really it's to say, okay, the train can be at the platform or it can just pull on through the station, just continue on, and we can continue doing what we were doing. So I really like this metaphor. And actually, in our program in Stop OCD, we have a tool that has a nice guided mindfulness recording all about the mind train. And it really kind of helps you practice this concept with a nice mindfulness meditation recording. Okay, so like I said, sometimes we board automatically and we don't even notice when we're boarding. So, um, when you're kind of like already caught inside of it, when you're already reassuring yourself, when you're checking your feelings, imagining every possible outcome, um, trying to reach certainty. Yep. But really the idea is that noticing that you boarded the train, that's the important step here. You don't need to continue doing the compulsion in order to disembark from the train. You can notice that you're on the train and just say, oh, I'm going to get off now. I'm going to disembark. And really, it's this idea. Sorry, there's a truck outside. um, really the idea is that you don't need to criticize yourself for getting caught up and boarding the train automatically. That's what happens. This is our minds get wrapped up in these stories all the time. And OCD is really, really skilled at that. So essentially, the idea here is not to never board the train. It's really to just practice noticing once I boarded the train or once the train is arriving and become willing to step off the train. So again, just to kind of summarize this idea is that thoughts are experiences, they're not commands. And OCD has a really, really, really strong ability to treat thoughts as evidence and as meaningful facts, meaningful mental events, but really, so not just mental, but meaningful things about you and about the world. But thoughts are simply mental events. Okay. And if you feel distress, it doesn't automatically mean danger, right? It doesn't automatically mean that there is a lion coming towards us in the room, right? That's used to be when we were cavemen, that was the purpose of the feeling of danger, of distress. But now the same biological systems get turned on inside when we picture a presentation that we have at work in 2 weeks, or when we have something important to do that causes us anxiety. And essentially, also, yes, the idea that repetition, having the thought again and again, it also doesn't make the thought important. Again, it's kind of like the idea of the OCD radio. It doesn't, just because it keeps broadcasting, doesn't mean that it's important. And finally, the idea that urges can be noticed without acting on them. So we can have a thought or an urge, and I can say, okay, I'm noticing that the urge to wash my hands train is here, and I can choose to continue walking the dog and not be swept away and board that train. And really, it's the idea that when I have this kind of space between my thoughts and the kind of instructions, commands, facts, that's where, when I have that space, that's when I can choose to do something different and choose to not do a compulsion. And then that's where change comes. So again, I like to break it down into kind of practical tools. So I like to say to kind of these metaphors, the radio and the train metaphors is really about naming the message, right? So whenever you have an intrusive thought appearing, start by saying, okay, what is my mind saying right now? So maybe it's I am on the what if I caused harm train, something like that. Then so notice what my mind is saying. Then we try and name it. So we say, is it a familiar OCD story? Is it a warning about something? It could be. Is it some urge to do something? And then you ask yourself, okay, do I need to board this train? Is it gonna help me do something? Do I want to respond to it with a compulsion? Maybe you do. And that's also okay. Um, But ideally, then we want to return, right? We're going to decide, where do I want to place my attention now? And really, it's the goal is to be able to return, practice again and again, returning your attention to whatever you were previously doing, or to choose essentially where you want to put your attention towards. Um, yes. All right. So the next job of these metaphors is to help us make room for discomfort. So basically, ACT talks about discomfort being something that can be present. And like I said, we can choose what we want to do next. And it doesn't mean that we have to like the feeling, but we can allow it accept the feeling to be there without immediately trying to remove it through doing a compulsion. Okay, so the first classic metaphor is imagine that you're hosting a party. You invited a lot of people that you care about. There's lots of nice food and music, and everyone's talking. And then all of a sudden, call it the unwanted guest metaphor, this unwanted guest arrives. You really don't like this person. You didn't invite them. You really wish they would leave. And essentially, what you could do is you could spend the whole evening standing by the door and argue with them and watch them and make sure that they don't get into the party, into the middle of the living room. You could stand by the door and try and force them out. But then the entire party becomes all about this unwanted guest, right? You're no longer talking with your friends. You're not really participating in the party. So essentially, this one guest that you really didn't want or like has taken over your entire attention. And essentially, what happens with OCD is that your thoughts, intrusive thoughts, work in a very similar way, right? Your intrusive thought comes up, you begin maybe monitoring it or arguing with it, and you try and make it leave, right? And the thought might still be there, even though because often our tugging back against the OCD monster is futile. So the thought might still be there, but really your whole day can be organized around getting rid of this one unwanted thought. And essentially, this metaphor, the unwanted guest metaphor, um, proposes that the unwanted guest can be in the room without becoming the center of the party, right? So here in the picture, we have this OCD unwanted guest monster guy in the corner. He's there. He actually looks like he's having a terrible time, not the rest of the people at the party. So you don't have to kind of welcome them. They don't have to, it's not like we're saying, lay back and enjoy. No, like with the quicksand. No, we're not saying that. You don't have to be friends with the OCD monster or something. You just have to not make the entire party about removing them. Okay, so you can say something like, okay, I feel uncertainty, but I'm gonna keep um, on listening to my friend in this conversation, right? So it's really the idea is not to feel comfortable with this unwanted guest, the OCD, the intrusive thoughts, but it's really to kind of be able to reconnect with the rest of the room. So I really like this metaphor. And then another metaphor, also similar to this idea of making room for, along the lines of making room for discomfort, is that imagine that you're driving a bus. And then the passengers, they represent your thoughts, your emotions, your bodily sensations. And some of the passengers are quiet, but others are really, really loud, okay? And they're demanding. So they might yell, turn back or check again. Are you sure something's wrong? And really, the driver, you, becomes so focused on the passengers that you might stop following the route that you were driving on. And then, really, where you end up reacting to all the passengers, you may avoid certain roads, um, or maybe kids like imagine like you're a parent driving the bus and say, I'm not moving this car until everyone's quiet. And then you get stuck. And really, OCD begins directing your life in a similar way, right? Because we avoid places, because we know that we're going to be see triggers, maybe. Maybe we repeat actions, maybe we drive on the same road again and again. Um, and really, it's the idea is that this passengers on the bus metaphor says that you don't have to remove all of these difficult passengers before continuing on your route, right? They can still be there, they can repeat themselves, they can say you're making a mistake, but you're the driver. You're choosing where to go, right? You could say, okay, um, the the uncertainty passenger is coming with me while I'm sending that email, something like that, right? And so the idea here isn't I'm going to silence all the passengers on the bus. It's really that I'm going to just not let them steer the bus. I'm the driver. So having this idea of making room for discomfort is the idea of acceptance, right? Acceptance and commitment therapy. And I often have trouble with this word acceptance because it can be misleading, right? So in acceptance doesn't mean agreeing that the intrusive thought is true or that you have to like the discomfort. It really means that you allow the thoughts, the feelings, the uncertainty to be present without immediately trying to act and react to it using a compulsion. So it's this idea of trying to let go of the need to resolve it immediately and choosing to respond differently and essentially to choose to respond hopefully towards, we'll talk about this next, but towards what matters. And kind of, it's not that you're accepting that the fear is true, it's really more that you're accepting that the fear is present with you, kind of on the bus or in the party. And so this was really where ACT and exposure and response prevention go really well together, is because, like I said, during an exposure, we're intentionally bringing up the fear or the discomfort, right? Um, and so here we're not trying to get immediate relief, right? Because that's what happens with compulsions. Um, I see somebody raise their hand. If you could write in a question into the chat, and then we'll talk about them all at the end. Um, but good that you have questions. Really here, what we can do is we can use ACT metaphors to help us remember that the aim is to allow the distress to be there and then have the essentially to do nothing and have the emotional distress go down on its own. So really, it's the idea that this response prevention creates a new pattern because it says, okay, I felt anxious. I didn't do my compulsion. I continued forward. I continued doing the exposure. I stayed with it. And I felt, um, and I felt the, the distress subside on its own, essentially, or without that. So, what I want to say with ERP is that when you be basically it's to let it come along. That's what I like to say. So first, we want to notice what kind of unwanted guest or passenger on the bus has shown up. We want to allow them to be there, right? Let the intrusive thought, let the discomfort remain present. We want to prevent, right? We want to not use the compulsion. And then we want to continue. We want to continue doing the exposure. So you could say something like, oh, okay, the contamination passenger is here with me and it's telling me to wash because this feels disgusting. But I'm going to let it keep yelling at me and I'm still driving the bus and I'm going to keep touching the contaminated object, something like that. All right, so the final kind of jobs that we want to talk about today or goal is the idea of moving towards what matters and the idea of values, right? And again, like I said, it's going to be different for everyone. But really, it's the idea that the metaphor in this section is really going to help us connect to kind of willingness and the idea for having kind of a reason to move forward and make room for things. That makes sense. Okay, so basically, we talked a lot about allowing and accepting discomfort to be there, but we also want to understand what are we making room for, right? Because like I said at the beginning, OCD, it's very common for OCD to gradually take over more and more and more of your life. Maybe you stop traveling because you feel uncertain, withdraw from relationships, um, many things like that. And stop doing things, avoid doing things that you truly value and truly love doing. So essentially, the idea is that discomfort isn't the goal, but really what we want to do is ask ourselves kind of what would I be doing right now if I wasn't trying to get rid of this feeling? Or really, what part of my life do I want to regain control of or return to kind of thing? And then really that helps us kind of give context, right, towards what we're working towards because we don't want to just bring up discomfort for the sake of bringing up discomfort and exposures. And we're not just trying to move away from doing compulsions. We want to also move away from doing compulsions, but also make our lives richer and move towards things that matter towards us, not matter to us. So I like this metaphor of the compass. So imagine you're traveling with a compass, and really the compass, it can't remove bad weather, it can't make this difficult hiking path any easier, can't guarantee that nothing's going to go wrong. But simply what it can do is show you a direction, right? And values work in a really similar way, right? Because a value isn't a destination that you reach or complete something, but it's more of a direction that you can continue working and moving towards through your actions. So everybody has different values. So one person could value being a caring parent, or a reliable colleague, or somebody could be value being an active participant in their community. And really, there's no way that you could ever finish being caring or finish being connected, right? They're qualities that you can always continue expressing. And then what happens with OCD is that really it just basically creates obstacles to along the path, along the route, right? Um, and so it's really kind of important to distinguish between also the OCD kind of rules and your values, right? So OCD, so somebody might value being responsible. That's a great value, but OCD can kind of turn that value on its head and say, okay, I need to be completely certain and check repeatedly. Or the same thing with being kind or moral. And then OCD can really kind of twist that value into something that you need to constantly get reassurance seeking for, confess, or things like that. And really, I think what's important here is to have this idea of, like I said, psychological flexibility at the beginning and recognizing that OCD tends to just narrow not only our lives, right? Because it takes away things that we value, but narrow our focus and our definition and essentially demand for certainty. So, like I said, just to summarize this, is that values are essentially directions. They help describe how you want to show up. And they're different between goals, right? Goals are sorry, my dog. Um, Goals are things that can be completed. So it could be something like sandwich, attending maybe a family meal, but the value behind it could be connection, right? And that's never completed. So the values are there to help guide our actions. And like I said, the OCD can try and twist them into kind of rigid rules. And again, the idea to keep in mind is that this overarching idea of flexibility is that the idea is that the value is a direction on our compass. And we try and take small steps towards that. And really, just the movement forward, small steps, even when you have discomfort present, that's what matters. Okay, so how I like to use this compass metaphor practically is first to notice what is OCD pulling you towards, right? It could be different compulsions. Um, and then to ask yourself, okay, what matters to me in this specific moment? Could my value um, be that I actually want to be present maybe with my child, or I want to, um, it could be continue my therapy of I value working in my therapy and continue this exposure. And then third is to say, what's one small step that I can do in this direction, right? We're not saying a giant life decision. It could mean, okay, let me just stay with exposure for one more minute. Or maybe it could be, okay, I'm value being present with my child. I'm going to put my phone down for the next 5 minutes. Um, and then finally, can I do this step while accepting the fact that the discomfort is present? So like I said, choose the next step, not the perfect one. All right, so just to quickly go over, like I said at the beginning, not to kind of turn metaphors into compulsions. So we'll look at how to use metaphors without kind of turning them into these new OCD rules. So a metaphor could become a compulsion. So, for example, if somebody's repeatedly saying to themselves, okay, with a bus metaphor, they're just a passenger, they're just a passenger, or drop the rope, or checking whether the metaphor kind of worked. Do I feel better? Do I feel more diffused, distant from the thought? Um, and or really searching for the best metaphor. And really, what's helpful is to know that the metaphor doesn't have to create relief, but really it's the idea that we're trying to support a different action even when the discomfort is still there. So I just kind of did a quick summary here of what metaphor fits best in what moment. So when you're working really hard to kind of suppress a thought or solve some sort of certainty, when you're caught in that struggle, remember that we're working with this tug of war or quicksand metaphors. When you notice that you're treating your thoughts as a command, remember back to the radio or the mind train metaphor. When you're trying to remove discomfort, remember the party guest or the passengers on the bus metaphor. And when you really feel that you've lost sight of direction or that you feel that your OCD has taken over your entire life, then we can think about the compass metaphor and values. So again, I think what's really helpful is to choose one metaphor that really fits in that moment. Maybe say, okay, I'm pulling on the rope and I'm going to drop it, or I need to check my compass, and then use it as a brief reminder, right? You don't need to think about it so long. And then really just try and connect it to one small action that you can take. And then this is the big one that we keep saying, return to redirect your attention. So return either to the exposure that I was doing or what I was doing in life. And I think really the ideal situation is to measure the metaphor, success of the metaphor, by what it's helping me do, not how it's making me feel, right? Because we're still probably going to have the distress with us, right? It's the idea of accepting that it's there. So just to briefly go over everything that we talked about today is to first notice when the struggle with OCD is keeping you stuck. We want to treat thoughts as experiences, not instructions. We want to make room for discomfort without responding compulsively. We want to let what matters guide you, your values guide you, and guide your next step. And like I said, just use the metaphors briefly and then return to your action, return to your exposure, return to your um, daily life. So, so these are just some free resources that we have. So you can look on stopocd.com and we have recordings of our past webinars there, also on our YouTube. And I definitely encourage you guys to check us out on social media. It's really a great kind of opportunity for community, for a good kind of comprehensive center for information, for treatment options. Um, and like I said, here is the discount of $100 for the first month of our program. So using ProWeb 100. And if you have any questions specifically about the program, please don't hesitate to email support@stopocd.com. And if you have any more clinical questions, you can email me directly at maya@helpingminds.com. So I'll look at the Q&A now. So somebody asked, are the slides available to us after for training? So the whole webinar recording will be posted on our YouTube channel and emailed out to anyone that signed up. So that with the actual webinar link will be there, but not the PowerPoint. The next question is, any tips motivating kids or young teens to do the hard work of facing fear and avoidances? Wow, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I love working with kids and teens. And we're actually having a parent OCD, like Stop OCD parent program come out that'll be coming out shortly so that you can recommend to the parents of your clients for them to gain a lot of psychoeducation and tips on how to talking to their kids about it and working with their kids specifically about it. Um, and so just ask, is the parent training free? No, it's going to be part like another part of our program. Um, and we will shortly be advertising it soon. It's not ready yet. That was a little sneak preview. But in terms of motivating kids and young teens, I think the biggest thing is to start with understanding, right? So I'm going to go back to the beginning slide. I think very, very important is going over the understanding of the OCD cycle, right? Understanding what is happening to me, what and then really the idea that we can kind of attack this cycle at different places, and especially the idea of the interpretation of the thought and really using these different metaphors, maybe introducing to the your clients, the young kid clients, these different metaphors and saying, okay, so if I'm in a tug of war rope, tug of war with the OCD, what does dropping the rope look like for you? And then trying to working with these metaphors is a really good way for all of us to kind of describe their own experiences. Okay, so we have time for one more. Um, one more. So my son is going to college for the first time and has OCD surrounding people. What can he do to be okay with roommates and his intrusive thoughts? So I think it depends what the OCD is there. Um, so I would maybe if you want to share this recording with your son, but really, again, like I just said, the basic understanding of the OCD cycle is so powerful, and having these metaphors to kind of help understand the idea of accepting the discomfort while continuing on with your life, while continuing to cook, talk with my roommate, but still feel uncomfortable, and then saying, okay, the uncomfort is going to be there, the discomfort is going to be there, but I can direct my attention back to being with my roommate or cooking with them. Um, that is definitely something that I hope would help. But yeah, maybe they need to work with a therapist and do exposure and response prevention, right? Because what I've presented today are very, very broad kind of metaphors and explanations. And OCD is just very, very, very personal, and it can transform and take over different parts of everybody's lives. So often what's helpful is to work one-on-one with a therapist, and kind of map out the individual cycle. Great. I'm happy that they're doing therapy. That's great. All right, everyone. So thank you so much for your questions and thanks so much for attending. And have a great day.